The desert air shimmered with heat waves as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his night vision goggles. The sun had set 3 hours ago, but the rocks still radiated warmth like a furnace. His team of 8 Navy SEALs moved silently across the rocky terrain, their boots finding purchase on the unforgiving landscape. Each man carried 70 pounds of gear, weapons, and ammunition, yet they moved like ghosts through the darkness. Morrison had led countless missions in his 12 years as a SEAL, but something felt different about this one. The intelligence briefing had been rushed, the satellite imagery grainy, and the extraction plan seemed hastily thrown together. His gut told him they were walking into something bigger than command had let on. Sergeant First Class Tony Ramirez, his second in command, appeared beside him like a shadow. "Sir, we're approaching the ridgeline. Target compound is 2 clicks southeast." Morrison nodded and signaled for the team to take a knee. Through his scope, he could see the compound nestled in a valley below. The intel photos had shown a small terrorist cell operating from the location, maybe 6 to 8 fighters maximum. What he saw now made his blood run cold. The compound was massive. At least 40 structures spread across the valley floor, with guard towers positioned at strategic points. Vehicle patrols moved constantly between buildings, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. This wasn't a small cell. This was a major operations base. "Control, this is Reaper 6, Morrison whispered into his radio. "We have a significant discrepancy in target assessment, requesting immediate clarification and possible mission abort." Static filled his earpiece for long seconds before a voice crackled through. "Reaper 6, maintain mission parameters. Intel confirms target is as briefed. Execute as planned." Morrison felt his jaw clench. Someone back at headquarters was either incompetent or lying. Neither option gave him much comfort. He looked at his team, 8 of the finest warriors the Navy had ever produced, men who had followed him through hell and back. They deserved better than to be thrown away on a suicide mission based on faulty intelligence. Corporal Mike Spider, Webb crawled up beside them, his lean frame perfectly suited for reconnaissance work. "Boss, I've been watching the patrol patterns for the last hour. They've got overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. Motion sensors on the perimeter. This place is locked down tight." "What about the primary target?" Morrison asked. Webb consulted his notes. "Dr. Hassan Khalil is definitely in there. Thermal imaging shows a heat signature in the main building that matches his profile. But he's not alone. I count at least 60 hostiles in various positions around the compound." Morrison did the math in his head. 8 SEALs against 60 terrorists, with no element of surprise and limited ammunition. The mission was to extract Dr. Khalil, a nuclear physicist who had been kidnapped 3 weeks earlier. The man's knowledge of uranium enrichment processes made him invaluable to terrorist organizations and equally valuable to American interests. "Sir," Ramirez said quietly, "we could call for air support, level the place, and extract Khalil from the rubble." Morrison shook his head. "Too risky. If Khalil is killed in the strike, the mission fails. Besides, those buildings look like they have significant underground components. He could be anywhere." The team spread out along the ridge, each man finding a position with good visibility of the compound. Morrison studied the layout through his scope, looking for any weakness in their defenses. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that this was a trap. "Control, Reaper 6 requesting immediate exfiltration," he said into his radio. "Situation has changed significantly. Recommend aborting mission." The response was swift and cold. "Negative, Reaper 6. Mission is critical. You will proceed as ordered. Failure is not an option." Morrison heard something in the background of the transmission that made him freeze. Was that laughter? He replayed the conversation in his mind, analyzing every word, every inflection. Someone wanted his team in that compound, and it wasn't to rescue Dr. Khalil. "Boss," Webb whispered urgently. "We've got movement. Large convoy approaching from the north." Morrison swung his scope toward the road and felt his stomach drop. A line of vehicles stretched for nearly a mile, trucks, armored personnel carriers, and what looked like two main battle tanks. Conservative estimate put the incoming force at over 200 fighters. That's it, Morrison decided. We're pulling back. Ramirez signaled general retreat. We'll establish an observation post 5 clicks north and wait for backup. As his team began their careful withdrawal, Morrison's radio crackled to life again. Reaper 6, you are ordered to proceed with the mission immediately. Any attempt to withdraw will be considered insubordination. Morrison ripped the radio from his ear and stared at it in disbelief. Someone was willing to sacrifice 8 SEALs to get them into that compound. The question was why. Sir, Corporal Danny Martinez called softly. We've got a problem. Morrison looked where Martinez was pointing and saw the truth of their situation. The convoy hadn't been heading for the compound. It had been moving to surround their position. Vehicle lights were now visible on all sides of their location, forming a tight perimeter. They were trapped. How many? Morrison asked. At least 100 vehicles. Maybe 300 fighters. Martinez's voice was steady despite the gravity of their situation. Sir, I think someone sold us out. Morrison felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. His team was trapped on a barren ridge with limited ammunition, surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, with no support coming and no way out. Worse yet, he was beginning to suspect their own government had betrayed them. All right, people, he said calmly. We're in a tough spot, but we've been in tough spots before. We're Navy SEALs. We don't quit, and we don't leave anyone behind. The team took up defensive positions among the rocks, each man checking his weapon and ammunition count. Morrison calculated they had maybe 2 hours of sustained firefight before their ammo ran out. After that, it would come down to hand-to-hand combat against impossible odds. Ramirez, take Webb, and Martinez. Set up on the north face. Watch for the main assault. Morrison's voice was calm and professional. Johnson and Peterson, you've got the south approach. Thompson and Rodriguez cover the east. I'll handle the west and coordinate. As his men moved into position, Morrison tried his radio one more time on an emergency frequency. Any station, this is Reaper 6. 8 American personnel surrounded and in immediate need of assistance. Grid coordinates follow. He transmitted their location and waited. The only response was the sound of engines growing louder as the enemy forces closed in. The first shots came from the south. Peterson's rifle cracked 3 times in rapid succession, followed by the distinctive whine of incoming bullets. Morrison could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as the enemy began probing their defenses. Contact south, Peterson reported. Multiple hostiles advancing in squad formation. Copy that. Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count. Morrison peered through his scope at the western approach. Shadows moved between the rocks as enemy fighters worked their way closer. He selected his first target, a man with an RPG launcher, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, and the target dropped. The battle had begun. For the next hour, the small team of SEALs held their position through superior training and discipline. Every shot was carefully aimed, every movement calculated to maximize their defensive advantage. But ammunition was running low, and the enemy seemed endless. Sir, Ramirez called over the gunfire. I count at least 40 dead hostiles, but they keep coming. We're down to our last magazines. Morrison looked around at his team. Each man was dirty, sweating, and exhausted, but their eyes still held determination. These were the finest warriors America had ever produced, and they would fight to the last bullet. Listen up, Morrison called to his team. If this is where we make our stand, then we make it count. History will remember what we do here tonight. Just as he finished speaking, Johnson's voice crackled over the radio with excitement. Sir, you need to see this. Due west, about 800 meters up on that cliff face. Morrison swung his scope toward the location Johnson had indicated. At first he saw nothing but rock and shadow. Then a muzzle flash caught his attention, not from below where the enemy fighters were positioned, but from high above. Another flash, and one of the enemy machine gun positions went silent. Then another, and a sniper who had been giving them trouble simply disappeared. "Who the hell is that?" Webb whispered over the radio. Morrison watched in amazement as enemy fighters began falling with mechanical precision. Someone was out there with a high-powered rifle, and they were systematically eliminating threats to his team. But who and why? The enemy forces below seemed just as confused. Their coordinated assault began to falter as squad leaders and heavy weapons operators were picked off with surgical accuracy. Panic began to spread through their ranks as the invisible sniper continued their deadly work. "Control, this is Reaper 6. Morrison tried his radio again. "We have an unknown friendly providing fire support, requesting identification and coordination." Silence. Morrison studied the cliff face where the shots were coming from. The distance was extraordinary, well over 800 meters, and the shots were being made in near total darkness. Whoever was up there possessed exceptional skill. As if responding to his thoughts, his radio crackled with a voice he had never heard before. The accent was American, but the tone was unlike any military communication he had received. "Reaper 6, this is Overwatch. Recommend you and your team remain in current positions. I'm going to clear you a path." The voice was calm, professional, and unmistakably female. Morrison felt hope surge through his chest for the first time since the mission began. "Overwatch, this is Reaper 6. Identify yourself. What's your unit?" "No time for introductions, Commander. You've got approximately 200 hostiles converging on your position. I'm going to thin the herd." What happened next defied everything Morrison thought he knew about combat. The mysterious sniper began systematically destroying the enemy force with a precision and speed that seemed almost supernatural. Machine gun nests fell silent. Mortar teams were eliminated before they could fire a round. Vehicle-mounted weapons were destroyed with single shots. But it was more than just accuracy. The sniper seemed to understand the enemy's tactical movements before they made them. She was always one step ahead, always targeting the right person at the right moment to create maximum chaos in their ranks. "How is she doing this?" Martinez whispered in awe. Morrison watched enemy fighters abandoning their positions in panic. What had been a coordinated assault by overwhelming numbers was rapidly becoming a rout. The mysterious woman on the cliff was single-handedly turning the tide of battle. "Sir," Ramirez called urgently. "Large group of hostiles moving to flank us from the north. About 30 fighters in light vehicles." Before Morrison could respond, the radio crackled again. "I see them, Reaper 6. Taking them now." Morrison watched through his scope as the lead vehicle in the convoy suddenly swerved and crashed. The second vehicle tried to avoid the wreck and flipped over. One by one, the drivers of the remaining vehicles were eliminated with precise headshots, causing a massive pileup that blocked the northern approach entirely. "Jesus Christ, your Webb muterid. She's not human." Morrison was beginning to think Webb might be right. No single sniper should be able to maintain this level of accuracy and speed for this duration. The woman was firing continuously, barely pausing to acquire new targets, and every shot was finding its mark. The radio crackled again. "Reaper 6, I'm going to need you to trust me. In 60 seconds, I want you and your team to move to the eastern edge of your position. There's going to be a significant explosion to your west." Morrison looked at his watch and then at his team. Everything about this situation violated his training and experience, but the mysterious sniper had already saved their lives. "You heard the lady. Move east. Now." The team repositioned just as the countdown reached 0. The explosion that followed lit up the entire valley. Morrison realized the sniper had been targeting fuel supplies and ammunition dumps in addition to personnel. The resulting chain reaction destroyed a significant portion of the enemy's equipment and scattered their remaining forces. In the sudden quiet that followed, Morrison tried to process what had just happened. 8 SEALs had been facing certain death against overwhelming odds. Now, thanks to one woman with a rifle, they had a fighting chance. "Overwatch, He called the news radio. Situation report? Approximately 60 hostiles remaining. They're regrouping near the main compound. Recommend you begin moving toward Extraction Point Charlie. Morrison checked his map. Extraction Point Charlie was 8 kilometers northeast of their current position. It would be a difficult trek through enemy territory, but with their numbers reduced, it might be possible. Negative, Overwatch. We still have a mission to complete. Dr. Khalil is in that compound. There was a long pause before the woman responded. Commander, your mission parameters were compromised before you ever left base. Dr. Khalil was moved 3 days ago. You've been sent here to die. Morrison felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed by someone who obviously had access to better intelligence than he did was devastating. How do you know this? He demanded. Because I've been tracking this operation for 2 weeks. Your government has been infiltrated at the highest levels. This mission was designed to eliminate your team because you were getting too close to the truth. Morrison looked at his men, all of whom were listening to the radio conversation. 8 of America's finest warriors had been betrayed by their own country and sent to die in a foreign desert. The rage that filled him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. What truth? He asked quietly. The response would change everything they thought they knew about their mission, their country, and their war. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before the woman's voice returned to Morrison's radio. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of terrible knowledge. 3 months ago, your team eliminated a terrorist cell in Yemen. You recovered a laptop containing financial records. Those records showed massive payments from a shell corporation to various terrorist organizations. What you didn't know is that Shell Corporation is owned by Defense Secretary Richard Hawthorne. Morrison felt the world shift beneath his feet. Hawthorne was the second most powerful man in the Defense Department, a man he had met personally during award ceremonies. That's impossible. Commander, Hawthorne has been funding terrorism for 18 months. He's been using taxpayer money channeled through defense contracts to arm the very people you've been fighting. Your team discovered his operation without knowing it. He's been trying to eliminate you ever since. Ramirez moved closer to Morrison, his face grim. Sir, that would explain why our missions have been going wrong lately. Someone's been feeding our positions to the enemy. Morrison thought back to their last 6 operations. Each one had encountered unexpected resistance. Each one had felt like walking into a trap. Now he knew why. Overwatch, if this is true, why are you helping us? Who are you? There was another long pause. When the woman spoke again, her voice carried a note of personal pain. My name is Captain Sarachun. I was an Army Ranger sniper until 6 months ago. Hawthorne had my unit eliminated when we got too close to the truth. I'm the only survivor. Morrison absorbed this information while scanning the valley below. The remaining enemy forces were regrouping, but they seemed hesitant to advance after watching their comrades get systematically eliminated by an invisible sniper. How many in your unit? He asked quietly. 12 Rangers. Good people. Hawthorne sent them to retrieve the same laptop you found, but he made sure they walked into an ambush. I was providing overwatch from 2 kilometers out when it happened. I watched my friends die because our own government betrayed them. The raw emotion in Chen's voice made Morrison's chest tighten. He knew what it was like to lose good soldiers, but to lose them to betrayal by their own side was a special kind of hell. So you've been hunting Hawthorne ever since? I've been gathering evidence, building a case. Tonight was supposed to be surveillance only, but when I saw they were trying to do to you what they did to my team, I couldn't stand by and watch. Morrison looked at his men. Each face showed the same mixture of anger and determination. They had dedicated their lives to serving their country, only to discover their country was trying to kill them. What's the play, Captain? How do we get out of this alive? Chen's response was immediate and professional. There's a NATO observation post 40 kilometers northeast of your position. If we can get you there with the evidence I've collected, we can expose Hawthorne's operation. But we have to move now. He's got a kill team en route to finish what the terrorists couldn't. Kill team. Black Ops contractors. No military identification. They'll eliminate all witnesses and blame it on the terrorists. Hawthorne's used this playbook before. Morrison checked his watch. They had maybe 3 hours until dawn. Moving 40 kilometers through hostile territory with 8 exhausted men would be challenging under the best circumstances. With enemy forces actively hunting them, it would be nearly impossible. Can you provide overwatch for the entire route? Negative. I'll have to move parallel to your position. There are several choke points where I won't have line of sight. You'll be on your own for significant stretches. Morrison made his decision. All right, people. New mission parameters. We're going to expose a traitor and save our country. Load up. We're moving in 5 minutes. As his team prepared to move, Morrison heard vehicles approaching from the south. Through his scope, he could see a convoy of black SUVs racing toward their position. No military markings, no identification numbers. Shouldn't have been right about the kill team. Overwatch, we've got company from the south. Black vehicles, no markings. I see them. Get your team moving northeast. I'll delay them as long as possible. Morrison watched in amazement as Chun began engaging the convoy from her position on the cliff. Her first shot took out the lead vehicle's driver, causing it to veer off the road and roll down a steep embankment. The second shot shattered the windshield of the following vehicle, and Morrison could see the passenger slump forward. But there were too many vehicles for even Chun to stop them all. Several SUVs made it through her gauntlet and began deploying troops in tactical formation. These weren't regular soldiers or even terrorists. These men moved with the precision and equipment of elite special forces. Sir, Webb called out urgently. These guys know what they're doing. Military training, top-tier equipment. They're spreading out in a search pattern. Morrison counted at least 20 operators dismounting from the vehicles. Each carried advanced weapons and night vision equipment. Worse, they were using hand signals and tactical movement that suggested extensive training in hunting special operations personnel. Move out, Morrison ordered. Stealth approach. Maintain radio silence except for emergencies. The SEALs began their careful withdrawal from the ridge, using every bit of cover the rocky terrain provided. Morrison took one last look at the cliff where Chun was positioned. Muzzle flashes continued to strobe in the darkness as she engaged multiple targets, but he knew she couldn't hold them forever. As they moved through the desert, Morrison's mind raced with the implications of what Chun had told them. If Defense Secretary Hawthorne was funding terrorism, how deep did the corruption go? How many other operations had been compromised? How many good soldiers had died because of his betrayal? The team moved in single file, each man maintaining visual contact with a soldier ahead and behind. The terrain was unforgiving, loose rock that could trigger landslides, hidden crevices that could break an ankle, and thorny vegetation that caught on equipment and clothing. After an hour of careful movement, they reached a narrow valley that offered concealment, but limited the routes they could take. Morrison called a brief halt to check their position and assess their condition. Every man was showing signs of fatigue, but their discipline remained solid. Water break. 2 minutes, Morrison whispered. As his team hydrated, Morrison tried to raise Chun on the radio. Overwatch, what's your status? Static filled his earpiece for several seconds before Chin's voice came through, strained but controlled. I'm mobile. Had to abandon my original position when they brought up more teams. I'm tracking 2 kilometers south of your position. What's the status of the kill team? Reduced, but not eliminated. I count 12 operators still in pursuit. They're good, Commander. They're using thermal imaging and sound detection equipment. They'll find your trail eventually. Morrison cursed silently. Thermal imaging would show their heat signatures even hours after they passed through an area. Sound detection equipment could pick up their movement from considerable distances. The enemy had technology advantages that made stealth increasingly difficult. How long until they reach our current position? 30 minutes, maybe less. Morrison made a quick calculation. In 30 minutes, his team might be able to cover 3 kilometers if they pushed hard. But that would leave them exhausted and vulnerable. They needed a different approach. Can you create a diversion? Draw them off our trail. There was a pause before Chin responded. Negative. If I engage them directly, I'll compromise my position. I need to stay mobile to provide support during your exfiltration. Morrison studied the terrain ahead through his scope. The valley narrowed into a canyon about 2 kilometers ahead, with steep walls on both sides. It would be perfect for an ambush, but it would also trap his team if the enemy got ahead of them. Ramirez, what do you think about that canyon ahead? His second-in-command studied the terrain through his own scope. It's risky, sir. Good defensive position, but only one way out. If they flank us, we're trapped. What if we set an ambush? Take out their pursuit team here. With what ammunition? We're down to maybe 30 rounds per man, against 12 operators with superior equipment. Morrison knew Ramirez was right, but he didn't like their alternatives. Running through open desert with thermal imaging tracking them was a slow death sentence. Sir, Webb called softly. Movement to the east. Looks like a patrol. Morrison swung his scope toward the eastern ridge and felt his stomach sink. Another team of 6 operators was moving parallel to their route, clearly attempting to flank them. The kill team was more sophisticated than he had anticipated. Overwatch, we've got a flanking element to the east. 6 operators moving to cut us off. Chen's response was immediate. I see them. Engaging now. Morrison watched as the eastern patrol suddenly scattered, taking cover behind rocks as Chen's bullets began finding their range. 2 operators went down in the first volley, but the others quickly established a defensive position and began returning fire with automatic weapons. The sound of gunfire echoed across the desert, and Morrison knew their stealth approach was blown. The remaining pursuit team would move aggressively toward their position now. Change of plans, Morrison announced to his team. We're going to ground. Set up a defensive perimeter. We make our stand here. His men immediately began positioning themselves among the rocks, creating overlapping fields of fire. Morrison knew they were severely outgunned, but SEAL training emphasized using superior tactics and discipline to overcome numerical disadvantages. Sir, Martinez called out. I've got eyes on the main pursuit team. 12 operators advancing in leapfrog formation. Range 800 meters and closing. Morrison watched the enemy's approach through his scope. These men were definitely Special Forces caliber, possibly former SEALs or Rangers themselves. They moved with textbook precision, using cover effectively and maintaining proper spacing. Wait for my signal. Morrison instructed his team. Let them get close enough to make our shots count. As the enemy closed to within 400 meters, Morrison could see their equipment more clearly. Night vision goggles, advanced communications gear, and weapons he didn't immediately recognize. These weren't standard military contractors. Overwatch, he called it Chun. These operators are carrying some kind of advanced weaponry. Can you identify? Prototype rail rifles. Hawthorne's been funneling military research to private contractors. Those weapons are 10 years ahead of anything in standard military inventory. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Rail rifles used electromagnetic acceleration to fire projectiles at tremendous velocities. They could punch through body armor like paper and had effective ranges far beyond conventional weapons. How do we fight something like that? Very carefully. The weapons have limited ammunition capacity and long reload times. If you can force them to waste their shots, you might have a chance. Morrison relayed this information to his team. They would have to be smarter and more disciplined than ever before. Every shot would have to count, and they would have to avoid giving the enemy clear targets. The first rail rifle discharge came without warning. The distinctive whine of the electromagnetic accelerator was followed immediately by an explosion of rock just meters from Peterson's position. The round had punched completely through a boulder that would have stopped conventional ammunition. Take cover, Morrison shouted, but his men were already moving. The battle that followed was unlike anything Morrison had experienced in his military career. The enemy's advanced weapons gave them a significant range advantage, but the SEAL's superior knowledge of tactics and terrain began to level the playing field. Webb managed to eliminate one operator by waiting for him to reload, then making a precision shot during the weapon's vulnerable moment. Rodriguez used a series of flanking maneuvers to get close enough to engage with conventional weapons. But the real turning point came when Chun began systematically targeting the kill team from her mobile position. Her shots weren't just accurate, they were tactically brilliant. She would wound one operator, then eliminate the two who moved to help him. She would destroy equipment, forcing the team to abandon their technological advantages. "She's incredible," Martinez whispered as they watched another enemy operator fall to Chen's rifle. "I've never seen shooting like that." Morrison had to agree. Chen was operating at a level beyond anything he had encountered. Her understanding of battlefield tactics, combined with her exceptional marksmanship, was turning the tide of an impossible battle. But the enemy had one more surprise. As Chun eliminated the last of the flanking team, Morrison heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. "Overwatch, we've got air support incoming. Attack helicopter, range unknown." Chen's response was grim. Apache gunship, thermal targeting, 30mm cannon, Hellfire missiles. "We need to get a cover immediately." Morrison looked around at the rocky terrain. There was very little that would stop an Apache's weapon systems. They were about to face their most serious threat yet. "All teams, find hard cover. Helicopter inbound." As his men scrambled for the largest rocks they could find, Morrison watched the Apache crest the southern ridge. The sight of the gunship silhouetted against the stars sent a chill through his entire team. They had faced overwhelming odds before, but never from their own military equipment. The helicopter began its attack run, and Morrison knew their situation had just gone from desperate to impossible. 8 exhausted SEALs with limited ammunition could not fight an Apache gunship with conventional weapons. But as the helicopter lined up for its first missile strike, Morrison heard something that gave him hope. Chen's voice came over the radio, calm and determined despite the impossible odds they faced. "Reaper 6, I'm going to try something. When I give the signal, I need your entire team to move northeast as fast as possible. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just run." Morrison watched through his scope as the Apache prepared to fire. In seconds, Hellfire missiles would turn their position into a crater. Whatever Chen had planned, she would have to execute it perfectly or they would all die in the desert. The signal came just as the helicopter's targeting system locked onto their position. "Now, move northeast. Go, go, go." Morrison and his team sprinted northeast across the rocky terrain as the Apache helicopter's targeting system locked onto their former position. The whine of the Hellfire missiles' approach filled the air, followed by a devastating explosion that sent chunks of rock flying in all directions. The blast wave knocked Peterson off his feet, but Rodriguez hauled him upright without breaking stride. Behind them, Morrison could hear the Apache banking for another attack run. The helicopter's thermal imaging would easily track their heat signatures across the open ground. They had maybe 20 seconds before the next missile strike would turn them all into vapor. Then, something impossible happened. Morrison heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle from somewhere behind them, followed immediately by a spectacular explosion in the sky. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the Apache spinning out of control, its tail rotor destroyed by what could only have been an incredibly precise sniper shot. How the hell did she hit a moving helicopter with a rifle? Webb gasped as they continued running. Morrison didn't have an answer. The shot Chun had made violated everything he knew about ballistics and physics, hitting a helicopter's tail rotor from ground level, in darkness, while the aircraft was maneuvering, was theoretically impossible with conventional weapons. The Apache crashed into the valley floor with a thunderous explosion that lit up the entire landscape. Secondary explosions followed as the aircraft's remaining missiles detonated, creating a fireworks display that could be seen for miles. "Overwatch," Morrison called into his radio. "That was incredible shooting. How did you manage that shot?" Chen's response was breathless but calm. "Lucky shot, Commander. The pilot flew into my crosshairs at the perfect moment. We need to keep moving. That explosion will draw every hostile in the area." Morrison knew luck had nothing to do with it. What Chen had accomplished required skills beyond anything he had encountered in his military career. But there would be time for questions later. Right now, they needed to put distance between themselves and the crash site. The team maintained their northeastern heading for another hour, pushing through their exhaustion by pure force of will. The rocky terrain gave way to sandy hills dotted with sparse vegetation. The going was easier, but they were more exposed to observation. "Sir," Ramirez called softly, "we've got vehicle movement on the horizon. Multiple contacts coming from the southeast." Morrison used his scope to scan the area Ramirez had indicated. A convoy of military vehicles was approaching their general area, trucks, jeeps, and what looked like two more helicopters providing air support. Those aren't friendlies, Morrison determined after studying their movement pattern. They're conducting a search sweep. Hawthorne's bringing in reinforcements. Chen's voice crackled over the radio. "I count 26 vehicles in the main convoy. Estimated 150 personnel. 2 helicopter gunships providing overwatch. They're conducting a systematic grid search of the entire area." Morrison did quick calculations in his head. His team had covered maybe 12 kilometers from their original position. They still had 28 kilometers to reach the NATO observation post. At their current pace, that meant at least 5 more hours of movement, assuming they didn't encounter resistance. "Can we outrun them?" he asked Chun. "Negative. They're moving faster than you can on foot, and they have air support coordinating the search. We need to find a way to slow them down or redirect their attention." Morrison studied the terrain ahead through his scope. The landscape was becoming more mountainous, with deep valleys and steep ridges that could provide concealment. But it would also slow their movement and limit their options if they were cornered. What about an ambush? Take out one of their search elements. Too risky with your current ammunition situation. These aren't terrorists or contractors. These are regular military units that Hawthorne has convinced they're hunting foreign infiltrators. If you kill American soldiers, you'll be branded as traitors. Morrison felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They were being hunted by their own military, betrayed by their own government, with no way to fight back without becoming the criminals they were accused of being. Then, what's the solution? Chen's response surprised him. "We make them think they've already found us. I'm going to create a diversion that draws the entire search force away from your route." "What kind of diversion?" "The kind that probably gets me killed, but it'll give you and your team time to reach the NATO base." Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Negative, Overwatch. We're not leaving you behind. We stick together." "Commander, you have evidence of a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of our government. Getting that evidence to NATO is more important than any of our individual lives. This is bigger than us." Morrison knew Chun was right, but everything in his training and personal code rebelled against abandoning someone who had risked her life to save his team. SEALs didn't leave people behind, especially people who had proven themselves in combat. "There has to be another way." "Sir," Martinez called urgently. "The search convoy is changing direction. They're heading straight for us." Morrison looked through his scope and saw that Martinez was right. The lead vehicles had altered course and were now moving directly toward their position. Either they had been spotted or the enemy had better intelligence about their route than expected. "How long until they reach us?" Morrison asked. 20 minutes, maybe less." Morrison made a command decision. "We're going to ground, find defensive positions, and prepare for contact. If we're going to fight, we fight on our terms." The team immediately began looking for tactical positions among the rocky outcroppings. The area they had chosen wasn't ideal for defense, but it offered better fields of fire than the open ground they would encounter if they continued running. "Overwatch," Morrison called to Chun. "We're setting up a defensive position at grid reference 77 Alpha. Can you provide support?" "Roger that. I'm moving to an elevated position with Overwatch capabilities." "But, Commander, you need to understand something about these approaching units." "What's that?" "I've been monitoring their radio communications. They've been told you're foreign agents who murdered American personnel at your previous location. As far as they know, they're conducting a legitimate operation against enemy infiltrators." Morrison absorbed this information with growing anger. Hawthorne hadn't just betrayed them. He had turned their own military against them. American soldiers were about to attack American soldiers because of one man's treachery. "Can we communicate with them?" Explain the situation. Their communications are encrypted and monitored. Hawthorne's people are coordinating the operation from CENTCOM. Any transmission you make will be jammed or intercepted. Morrison looked at his men, all of whom had been listening to the radio conversation. Each face showed the same mixture of anger and determination. They were about to fight their own countrymen because a traitor in Washington had manipulated the situation. "All right, people," Morrison said quietly. "New rules of engagement. These are American soldiers following orders based on false information. We use non-lethal force only. Aim to disable, not kill. Target vehicles and equipment, not personnel." It was a nearly impossible tactical challenge. Fighting to disable rather than kill required precision shots under combat stress, with limited ammunition, against superior numbers. But Morrison knew his team would rather die than murder innocent American soldiers. The first contact came sooner than expected. A reconnaissance element of 2 jeeps crested the ridge to their south, immediately spotting the SEALs' position. Morrison watched through his scope as the soldiers in the vehicles reached for their radios to report the contact. Chen's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. Both radio antennas on the vehicles disintegrated, preventing them from communicating with the main force. The soldiers dove for cover, confused but not seriously threatened. "Nice shooting, Overwatch," Morrison commented. "I'm trying to buy you time without creating casualties. But the main force will investigate when these teams don't report in." Morrison counted the soldiers in the reconnaissance element. 8 men, well-trained and equipped, but now cut off from their supporting units. If his team could neutralize them quietly, it might delay the larger search force. "Webb, Martinez with me. We're going to try to talk to them." Morrison led 2 of his men in a careful approach toward the disabled vehicles. The soldiers had taken cover behind rocks and were clearly preparing for a firefight. Morrison had to convince them to stand down without revealing too much about their situation. "American personnel," Morrison called out when they were within voice range. "We need to talk." "Identify yourselves," came the response. "You're surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender." Morrison exchanged glances with Webb and Martinez. These soldiers were following proper procedures, but they had no idea of the larger situation they were involved in. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, United States Navy. We're American Special Operations personnel conducting a classified mission. Your commanders have been given false information about our status." There was a long pause before the response came. "That's impossible. We have positive identification of you as foreign infiltrators. You've already killed American personnel tonight." Morrison felt frustration building in his chest. Hawthorne's deception was more thorough than he had anticipated. These soldiers genuinely believed they were hunting enemy agents. "Listen carefully," Morrison called out. "I'm going to give you information that you can verify through proper channels. Our operation was betrayed by Defense Secretary Richard Hawthorne. He's been funding terrorist organizations and eliminating military personnel who discovered his activities." "That's enough," the voice responded. "We're not listening to enemy propaganda. Surrender now, or we will use deadly force." Morrison realized that words weren't going to solve this problem. The soldiers had been too thoroughly briefed against exactly this kind of psychological warfare. He would have to find another way to neutralize them without causing casualties. Chen's voice crackled over his radio. "Commander, the main force is 10 minutes out. If you're going to resolve this situation, it needs to be now." Morrison made a quick decision. "Webb, Martinez, flanking maneuver. Target their weapons, not them. We disable their capability to fight and move out." The 3 SEALs separated and began a careful approach on the soldiers' position. Morrison knew his men well enough to trust their judgment about when to use lethal versus non-lethal force. These were professionals who could make precision shots under pressure. The engagement was brief and decisive. Webb's first shot destroyed the machine gun mounted on one of the jeeps. Martinez disabled the other vehicle by putting a round through its engine block. Morrison eliminated 2 assault rifles with carefully aimed shots that rendered them inoperable without harming their operators. In less than 30 seconds, 8 American soldiers found themselves without functional weapons or transportation, confused and effectively neutralized. "Now we move," Morrison ordered his team, "before the main force arrives." As they withdrew from the engagement site, Morrison heard vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The search force was converging on their position faster than anticipated. "Overwatch, what's your status?" he called to Chun. "I'm in position with Overwatch on your route." "But, Commander, we have a bigger problem. I'm picking up radio chatter about additional forces being deployed from 3 different bases. Hawthorne is throwing everything he has at this operation." Morrison processed this information while leading his team through increasingly difficult terrain. They were climbing into genuine mountains now, with steep slopes and loose rock that made movement treacherous. But the elevation would give them better concealment and force the search vehicles to approach on predictable routes. How many additional forces? At least 300 personnel, plus air support. Helicopters, drones, and what sounds like an AC-130 gunship. Morrison felt his blood run cold. An AC-130 was essentially a flying artillery platform, capable of destroying entire city blocks with precision fire. If Hawthorne was willing to deploy that level of firepower, he was clearly desperate to prevent them from reaching the NATO base. "He's really going all out to stop us," Morrison observed. "Commander, I don't think he has a choice. If word of his operation gets out, he'll face charges of treason and terrorism. He's fighting for his life." Morrison considered their tactical situation. 8 exhausted SEALs with limited ammunition being hunted by hundreds of soldiers plus overwhelming air support across terrain that offered concealment but limited their movement speed. The odds are becoming impossibly stacked against them. But as he looked at his men, he saw the same determination that had carried them through every impossible mission they had ever faced. These were warriors who didn't quit, regardless of the odds. They would keep fighting until they accomplished their mission or died trying. "All right, people," Morrison said as they reached a relatively sheltered position among the rocks. "We're going to play this smart. Chun has given us the gift of time and information. We're going to use both to our advantage." Morrison spread out his map and began planning their next moves. The route to the NATO base led through a series of mountain passes that would force their pursuers into predictable choke points. With careful timing and Chin support, they might be able to stay ahead of the search forces. But first, they would have to survive the night. And as Morrison studied the terrain ahead, he realized their greatest challenge was yet to come. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the mountain walls, growing steadily louder as multiple aircraft approached their position. The real hunt was just beginning, and Morrison knew that everything they had faced so far was just preparation for the battles ahead. Chen's voice cut through the radio static with urgent intensity. "Commander, you need to see this. The AC-130 isn't just providing support. It's heading directly for the NATO observation post. Hawthorne is going to eliminate the witnesses before you can reach them." Morrison stared at his map in growing horror as he realized the full scope of Hawthorne's plan. The secretary wasn't just trying to eliminate Morrison's team. He was prepared to attack a NATO facility to prevent the truth from coming out. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything Morrison had imagined. This was no longer just about survival. This was about preventing an act of war that could destabilize international relations and cost countless innocent lives. The mission had changed, and failure was no longer an option. Morrison stared at his map with growing desperation as Chen's words sank in. The AC-130 gunship was heading for the NATO observation post, their only hope of exposing Hawthorne's conspiracy. If the secretary was willing to attack an allied facility, there were no limits to what he would do to protect his secret. How long until the AC-130 reaches the NATO base? Morrison asked urgently. 47 minutes at current speed, Chen replied. But, Commander, it gets worse. I'm monitoring communications from the observation post. They have no idea what's coming. Their defensive systems aren't designed to handle an American gunship. Morrison calculated distances on his map. The NATO base was still 18 kilometers away through mountainous terrain. Even moving at maximum speed, his team couldn't possibly reach the facility before the AC-130 arrived. "Can we warn them?" he asked. "Negative. Their communications are on a different network, and any transmission from our position will be intercepted by Hawthorne's forces. He's got the entire communications spectrum monitored." Morrison looked at his exhausted team. Every man was pushing beyond normal physical limits, driven by determination and professional pride. But there were limits to what even SEALs could accomplish. "What about you, Overwatch? Can you reach an elevated position with line of sight to the base?" There was a long pause before Chen responded. "Possibly. There's a ridge line that might give me visual contact, but I'd have to cross 15 kilometers of open ground with enemy forces converging on the area. And even if I make it, engaging an AC-130 with a rifle is suicide." Morrison felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Send Shun on a mission that would almost certainly get her killed, or let innocent NATO personnel die in an unprovoked attack by their own government. "There has to be another way," he said, but even as he spoke, he knew they were running out of options. Ramirez moved closer, studying the map over Morrison's shoulder. "Sir, what if we split up? Half the team continues toward the NATO base, while the other half creates a diversion to draw the AC-130 away." Morrison considered the tactical implications. Splitting his team would reduce their combat effectiveness, but it might be their only chance to accomplish both objectives. The question was who to send where, and whether either group would survive long enough to complete their missions. "Overwatch," Morrison called to Chun. "What's the tactical situation around the NATO base? How many personnel? What kind of defenses?" 23 NATO observers from 6 different countries. Standard perimeter security, but they're not expecting an attack from the air. They have anti-aircraft missiles, but they won't fire on an American aircraft without authorization from their home governments. Morrison realized the full scope of the trap Hawthorne had set. The AC-130 would approach under the cover of American military authority. The NATO personnel would assume it was a legitimate operation until the shooting started. By then, it would be too late. "What's the terrain like around the base?" "Mountainous, similar to your current area. Good concealment for ground forces, but limited approaches. If I can reach the western ridge, I might have shot at the gunship, but what? The range would be extreme, even for me. We're talking about a shot at the absolute limits of what's physically possible with conventional weapons." Morrison heard something in Chen's voice that made him pause. Throughout this entire ordeal, she had demonstrated capabilities that seemed beyond human limitation. Her shots had been impossibly accurate, her tactical awareness supernatural, and her knowledge of the enemy's movements uncanny. "Overwatch, I need to ask you something directly. Your performance tonight has been extraordinary. Are you using some kind of enhanced equipment? Experimental technology?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Chen responded. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of reluctant revelation. "Commander, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. 6 months ago, before my unit was eliminated, I was part of a special program. Military enhancement through neural interface technology. It allows direct connection between the human brain and advanced targeting systems." Morrison felt his world shift again. Military enhancement programs were the stuff of science fiction and conspiracy theories. But it would explain Chen's impossible accuracy and tactical awareness. "You're saying you're cybernetically enhanced. The technology interfaces with the visual cortex and motor control centers. It doesn't make me superhuman, but it does allow for precision and processing speed beyond normal human capability. The program was shut down after my unit was killed. Officially, it never existed." Morrison absorbed this information while watching his team prepare for movement. Chen wasn't just an exceptional sniper. She was a prototype for the future of military enhancement. And if Hawthorne was willing to kill enhanced soldiers to protect his secret, the conspiracy was even deeper than they had imagined. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" "Because revealing classified enhancement programs is treason. Even now, by telling you, I'm violating multiple federal laws. But, given the circumstances, I figured you deserve to know what you're dealing with." Morrison looked at the tactical situation with new understanding. Chen's enhanced capabilities might be their only chance of stopping the AC-130, but the range and target difficulty would push even enhanced abilities to their limits. What do you need from us to make this work? I need time and a clear field of fire. If your team can create enough confusion to delay the AC-130's attack run, I might be able to reach a firing position and take the shot. Morrison made his decision. Ramirez, take Webb, Martinez, and Johnson. Continue toward the NATO base at best possible speed. Rodriguez, Peterson, Thompson, you're with me. We're going to create the mother of all diversions. Ramirez nodded grimly. What's the objective, sir? Make Hawthorne think we've gone on the offensive. Attack his search forces, destroy equipment, cause so much chaos that he has to redirect resources away from the AC-130 mission. It was a desperate plan that would almost certainly result in casualties, but Morrison couldn't see any alternative. The conspiracy had to be exposed, and the NATO personnel had to be protected, regardless of the personal cost. As the team prepared to split up, Morrison tried to process the larger implications of what they had learned. Enhancement programs, government conspiracies, attacks on Allied facilities. The situation had spiraled far beyond anything he had trained for. Sir, Peterson called quietly. Multiple helicopters approaching from the south. Looks like they're beginning another search sweep. Morrison counted at least 6 aircraft in the formation. Attack helicopters, transport helicopters, and what looked like command and control aircraft. Hawthorne was deploying serious resources to eliminate 8 SEALs. That's our target, Morrison announced. We're going to take down that formation and make Hawthorne think we pose a direct threat to his air operations. Chen's voice crackled over the radio. Commander, engaging that formation with ground forces is suicide. Those aircraft have thermal imaging, night vision, and enough firepower to level a city block. That's why it'll work, Morrison replied. Hawthorne will have to divert resources to deal with a ground threat to his air assets. It'll buy you time to reach the firing position. Morrison looked at his 3 remaining men. Peterson, Rodriguez, and Thompson, each a veteran of countless operations, each willing to follow him into what they all knew was likely a suicide mission. Gentlemen, we're about to do something that goes against every tactical doctrine ever written. We're going to attack a helicopter formation with small arms and determination. Any questions? Thompson managed a grim smile. Yes, sir. What took us so long? Morrison felt a surge of pride in his team. These men had volunteered for the most dangerous job in the military, and they were still making jokes in the face of impossible odds. This was why America's enemies feared the SEALs, not just their training or equipment, but their unbreakable spirit. Overwatch, begin your movement toward the firing position. We'll commence our attack in 10 minutes. Roger that, Commander. And sir? Yes. It's been an honor working with you and your team tonight. Whatever happens, you've proven that there are still people worth fighting for. Morrison felt emotion tighten his throat. The honor has been ours, Overwatch. Make that shot count. As Chun began her dangerous journey toward the western ridge, Morrison led his reduced team toward the approaching helicopter formation. The aircraft were following standard search patterns, which made their movements predictable, but also made them extremely dangerous to approach. What's the plan, sir? Rodriguez asked as they moved through the rocky terrain. We're going to use the terrain to our advantage. Those helicopters have to maintain altitude to avoid ground obstacles, which limits their maneuverability. We'll position ourselves in overlapping positions and force them into defensive patterns. Morrison knew the plan was barely better than suicide, but it was their only option. For men with conventional weapons against 6 military helicopters was not a battle they could win, but they might be able to create enough chaos to serve their purpose. The first contact came sooner than expected. One of the scout helicopters detected their movement and immediately began circling their position. Morrison could see the aircraft's searchlight probing the rocks, looking for clear targets. Wait for my signal, Morrison whispered into his radio. Let them commit to an attack run, then hit them when they're focused on their targets. The helicopter began its approach, its crew confident that 4 soldiers on the ground posed no serious threat. Morrison waited until the aircraft was committed to its attack vector, then gave the signal. Now! 4 rifles fired simultaneously at different points on the helicopter. Peterson aimed for the tail rotor, Rodriguez targeted the main rotor assembly, Thompson focused on the engine intake, and Morrison went for the pilot's compartment. The combined fire had an immediate effect. The helicopter began spinning out of control as multiple systems failed simultaneously. Morrison watched in satisfaction as the aircraft crash-landed in a valley half a kilometer away. But their success triggered an immediate and overwhelming response. The remaining 5 helicopters converged on their position with weapons hot and no intention of showing mercy. "Move! Move! Move!" Morrison shouted as automatic cannon fire began chewing up the rocks around them. The teams scattered to different positions as the helicopters began coordinated attack runs. Morrison found cover behind a large boulder just as 20mm cannon rounds began impacting all around his position. The sound was deafening, and rock fragments filled the air like shrapnel. "Sir," Thompson called over the chaos. "This is working too well. They're bringing everything they have." Morrison looked up to see 2 additional helicopter formations approaching from different directions. Hawthorne was pulling resources from across the entire operation to deal with what he perceived as a serious threat to his air superiority. "Overwatch," Morrison called into his radio. "How's your progress?" Chin's response was breathless but determined. "Halfway to the firing position. The AC-130 is 23 minutes from a NATO base. Keep drawing their attention." Morrison ducked as another burst of cannon fire shattered the rocks above his head. The helicopters were becoming more aggressive, clearly frustrated by their inability to eliminate 4 soldiers who had already destroyed 1 aircraft. "Peterson, Rodriguez, concentrate fire on the lead helicopter. Make them think we have anti-aircraft capabilities." The 2 SEALs focused their fire on the lead attack helicopter, forcing it to break off its attack run and seek cover behind a ridgeline. The other helicopters immediately repositioned to provide mutual support, exactly the kind of defensive behavior that indicated they were taking the ground threat seriously. For the next 15 minutes, Morrison's team played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the helicopter formation. They would pop up from concealment, fire several aimed shots, then disappear before the aircraft could respond effectively. Each engagement forced the helicopters to waste time and ammunition on targets that refused to stay still long enough to be eliminated. But Morrison knew they couldn't sustain this pace much longer. His men were exhausted, their ammunition was running low, and the helicopters were beginning to coordinate more effectively. Soon, the enemy would find a way to pin them down and eliminate them with overwhelming firepower. "Overwatch," Morrison called urgently. "Status report, 2 minutes to firing position. The AC-130 is beginning its approach to the NATO base. I can see the base personnel starting to take notice, but they still don't realize what's happening." Morrison made a quick decision. "All units, prepare for final gambit. We're going to concentrate all our remaining fire on 1 target and try to bring down another helicopter. If we can create 1 more dramatic success, it might be enough." Morrison selected the closest attack helicopter as their target. The aircraft was hovering in a firing position, its crew focused on trying to locate Peterson's position behind a cluster of rocks. "On my mark," Morrison whispered. "Full automatic, everything we have left. 3, 2, 1 mark." 4 rifles opened fire simultaneously, pouring their remaining ammunition into the hovering helicopter. The concentrated fire overwhelmed the aircraft's defenses, and Morrison watched with grim satisfaction as it began trailing smoke and debris. But their ammunition was now exhausted, and the remaining helicopters were moving in for the kill. Morrison looked at his 3 men and saw the same resignation in their eyes. They had done everything possible to buy Chun the time she needed. "Gentlemen," Morrison said formally, "it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve with you." The helicopters began their final attack run, and Morrison prepared to face his end with the dignity befitting a Navy SEAL. But as the aircraft approached, Chen's voice cut through the radio static with words that changed everything. AC-130 in sight. Beginning engagement sequence. Wish me luck, Commander. Morrison looked up at the helicopters bearing down on his position and smiled grimly. If Chun could stop the AC-130, their sacrifice would have meaning. The truth would survive, even if they didn't. The sound of incoming missiles filled the air, and Morrison closed his eyes, thinking of his team's courage and Chen's impossible mission to save innocent lives with a single, impossible shot. Captain Sarah Chun reached the western ridge with less than 3 minutes to spare before the AC-130 would begin its attack on the NATO observation post. Her enhanced neural interface was already calculating wind speed, humidity, temperature, and a dozen other variables that would affect the impossible shot she was about to attempt. Below, in the valley, she could see the NATO facility, a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by communications equipment and defensive positions. 23 Allied personnel going about their routine duties, completely unaware that an American gunship was approaching with orders to eliminate all witnesses to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Through her scope, Chun could see the AC-130 circling at maximum range, its crew following standard protocols for engaging a ground target. The aircraft was maintaining an altitude of 8,000 feet and a distance of nearly 2 kilometers, well beyond the range of the base's defensive systems, but also at the absolute limit of what even her enhanced abilities could achieve. Her neural interface was feeding her constant updates on the target's movement, but the calculations were staggering. The AC-130 was traveling at 180 knots in a circular pattern, presenting a constantly changing angle and distance. Wind conditions at that altitude were different from ground level. The target itself was heavily armored and would require a precise hit on a critical system to disable. Chen activated her rifle's advanced targeting system, watching as data streams flowed directly into her visual cortex. Range, 1,847 meters and increasing. Wind speed at target altitude, 23 knots from the northwest. Target velocity, 185 knots on a circular pattern with a radius of approximately 800 meters. The neural interface calculated the probability of a successful hit at less than 12%. Chen smiled grimly as she settled into her firing position. 12% was better odds than Morrison and his team were facing against the helicopter formation. Sometimes impossible odds were all you had to work with. She began tracking the AC-130 through her scope, letting her enhanced reflexes learn the aircraft's movement pattern. The plane was maintaining perfect formation, its crew confident that they were far beyond the range of any ground-based threat. In 90 seconds, they would begin their attack run. Chen's radio crackled with Morrison's voice, strained but determined. Overwatch, missiles inbound on our position. Whatever you're going to do it now. Through her scope, Chun could see explosions lighting up the mountainside where Morrison's team was making their final stand. 4 SEALs against overwhelming odds, buying her the precious seconds she needed to attempt the impossible. She forced herself to block out the sounds of battle and focused entirely on her target. The AC-130 had completed another circle and was beginning to line up for its attack on the NATO base. Through her enhanced vision, she could see the aircrew making final preparations, unaware that they were about to commit an act of war against Allied personnel. Chen's finger found the trigger as her neural interface completed its final calculations. She had one shot, the range was extreme, the target was moving, and even with her enhancements, the probability of success remained minimal. But failure meant the death of innocent people and the continuation of a conspiracy that had already cost too many lives. The AC-130 began its attack run, descending slightly to improve accuracy against the NATO facility. Chun tracked the aircraft's movement, waiting for the perfect moment when multiple variables would align for a fraction of a second. Her interface highlighted the optimal targeting point, the aircraft's left engine nacelle, where a single well-placed shot could disable the plane without killing the crew. The window of opportunity would last less than 2 seconds. Chun held her breath and began her trigger squeeze, letting muscle memory and enhanced reflexes guide the shot. Time seemed to slow as her finger completed the trigger pull, sending a single round across nearly 2 kilometers of mountain air toward a target moving at close to 200 miles per hour. The bullet's flight time was just over 3 seconds. Chun watched through her scope as the round tracked toward the AC-130, her enhanced vision allowing her to actually see the projectile's trajectory. The aircraft continued its attack run, completely unaware that death was approaching at 3 times the speed of sound. The impact was spectacular. Chen's bullet struck the engine nacelle at precisely the angle calculated by her neural interface, penetrating the armor and severing critical fuel lines. The explosion that followed lit up the night sky as the entire left wing caught fire. Chen watched with professional satisfaction as the AC-130 banked sharply away from the NATO base, its crew fighting to maintain control as flames spread across the aircraft's left side. The attack run had been aborted, the NATO personnel were safe, and the conspiracy's deadliest weapon was neutralized. But her work wasn't finished. Morrison and his team were still under attack, and she was the only one who could provide them with support. Chun quickly repositioned her rifle toward the helicopter formation that was assaulting the SEAL team's position. Through her scope, she could see the situation was desperate. Morrison's team had taken cover in a rocky depression while 4 attack helicopters circled overhead like vultures. The helicopters were taking turns making attack runs, systematically destroying any cover the SEALs might use. Chun selected her first target, a helicopter that was beginning a gun run directly toward Morrison's position. Her enhanced targeting system calculated the lead angle automatically, and her finger was already squeezing the trigger before her conscious mind had fully processed the shot. The helicopter's tail rotor disintegrated under the impact of her bullet, sending the aircraft spinning out of control. It crashed into the mountainside with a thunderous explosion that lit up the entire battlefield. The remaining 3 helicopters immediately broke off their attacks, clearly recognizing they were facing a threat they couldn't locate or defend against. Chun used their confusion to eliminate a second aircraft with a shot that penetrated the cockpit and forced the crew to attempt an emergency landing. But even as she was engaging the helicopters, Chun could hear additional aircraft approaching from multiple directions. Hawthorne was throwing everything he had at this operation, and she couldn't hold off an entire air force by herself. Her radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. All units, this is NATO command. American aircraft AC-130 designation Ghost Rider has been observed conducting an unprovoked attack on NATO observation post 77. All American aircraft in the area are ordered to stand down immediately or face defensive action. Chun felt a surge of hope. The NATO personnel had witnessed the AC-130's attack and were now treating all American aircraft in the area as hostile. The conspiracy was beginning to unravel. The effect on the helicopter formation was immediate. Instead of continuing their attack on Morrison's team, the aircraft began withdrawing toward American-controlled airspace. Hawthorne's pilots were unwilling to risk being shot down by NATO forces who now viewed them as aggressors. Overwatch. Morrison's voice came over the radio, weak but alive. I don't know how you did it, but that shot just changed history. Chun smiled as she began packing her equipment. Just doing my job, Commander. What's the status of your team? Peterson took shrapnel from a near miss, but he'll live. Rodriguez has a broken arm from diving into cover. Thompson and I are operational. More importantly, we're all alive thanks to you. Chun felt relief flood through her system. Throughout this entire ordeal, her primary concern had been protecting the innocent people who were caught up in Hawthorne's conspiracy. Morrison's team, the NATO personnel, even the American soldiers who had been fed false information, all of them were victims of one man's treachery. What's our next move? Morrison asked. Before Chun could respond, her radio picked up a transmission on the NATO command frequency. All units, this is General Thompson, NATO Command. We have received confirmation of American government involvement in tonight's attacks. We are implementing Protocol 7 immediately. Chen knew what Protocol 7 meant. NATO was invoking emergency procedures to protect member nations from hostile action by allied governments. It was an unprecedented step that would trigger international investigations at the highest levels. Commander, Chen transmitted to Morrison, I think our mission just became a lot easier. NATO is handling this situation now. Over the next hour, Chen watched from her elevated position as NATO forces secured the area and began evacuating both Morrison's team and the observation post personnel. The burning wreckage of the AC-130 provided undeniable evidence of American aggression against Allied forces. But the most important development came when NATO investigators began examining the evidence Chen had collected over the past 6 months. Financial records, communication intercepts, and documented proof of Hawthorne's conspiracy were now in the hands of international authorities who couldn't be influenced or silenced by the American government. Chen's radio crackled with Morrison's voice as NATO medics treated his wounded team members. Overwatch, they want to debrief you. Can you come down from your position? Chen looked down at the NATO vehicles and personnel securing the area. After 6 months of being hunted and operating alone, the thought of human contact seemed almost surreal. Roger that, Commander. I'm coming down. The descent from the ridge took Chen 30 minutes, during which time she reflected on the events of the night. A routine surveillance mission had become a life-or-death struggle that exposed corruption at the highest levels of government and nearly triggered an international incident. When she finally reached the NATO perimeter, Chen was immediately surrounded by medical personnel and intelligence officers. Her enhanced abilities were obviously of great interest to the international community, but she was prepared for that scrutiny. Morrison appeared at her side, his face showing exhaustion, but also profound relief. Captain Chen, I wanted to thank you personally. Without your intervention, my team would be dead, and the conspiracy would remain hidden. Chen studied the SEAL commander's face. This was a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, only to discover that his country was willing to sacrifice him for political convenience. The betrayal had to be devastating, but his eyes still held the steady resolve of a professional warrior. Commander, what happened tonight was bigger than any of us. Your team's courage made the difference. You drew attention away from the main target and gave me the opportunity to make the shot that counted. A NATO intelligence officer approached them with a tablet computer displaying satellite imagery. Captain Chen, we've been monitoring the situation in Washington. Defense Secretary Hawthorne was arrested 20 minutes ago on charges of treason, terrorism, and conspiracy. Your evidence was transmitted directly to the Attorney General's office. Chen felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for 6 months. Since her unit had been murdered, she had lived with the knowledge that their killer was not only free, but actively working to eliminate anyone who might expose his crimes. What about the other conspirators? She asked. 17 arrests so far, including 3 generals, 2 admirals, and multiple civilian contractors. The financial evidence you collected led to bank accounts in 7 countries. This conspiracy was much larger than initially suspected. Morrison shook his head in amazement. How many people were involved? The intelligence officer consulted his tablet. Conservative estimate is over 50 people in key positions throughout the defense establishment. Secretary Hawthorne was funding terrorism to justify increased defense spending, then skimming profits from the resulting contracts. The amounts involved are staggering. Chen realized the full scope of what they had uncovered. Hawthorne hadn't just been betraying individual military units. He had been manipulating American foreign policy to create conflicts that would generate profits for his associates. The conspiracy had influenced military operations across multiple continents. What's going to happen to the affected operations? Morrison asked. Complete review and restructuring. Every mission that went through Hawthorne's office is being investigated. Every contract he approved is under audit. This is going to reshape how military operations are planned and executed. Chun looked at Morrison and his surviving team members. These men had paid a terrible price to expose the conspiracy, but their sacrifice had prevented countless other military units from being betrayed and killed. Over the next several hours, Chun and Morrison provided detailed debriefings to NATO investigators. The evidence Chun had collected, combined with Morrison's team's first-hand experience of the betrayal, painted a complete picture of the conspiracy's operations. As dawn broke over the mountains, Chun found herself standing with Morrison at the edge of the NATO compound, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of gold and red. The night of terror was ending, and, for the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. "What happens now?" Morrison asked quietly. Chun considered the question. Her enhancements made her valuable to any number of government agencies and military organizations. Morrison's team would need time to recover from their ordeal and the betrayal by their own government. "I think we rebuild," she said finally. The military lost some good people to this conspiracy, but it also showed that there are still people willing to fight for what's right, regardless of the cost. Morrison nodded slowly. "Your team in Yemen, they would be proud of what you accomplished tonight." Chun felt tears threatening for the first time since her unit had been killed. The 12 Rangers who had died because of Hawthorne's betrayal could finally rest in peace, knowing their deaths had been avenged and their sacrifice had meaning. "They were good soldiers," she said softly. "They deserved better than what happened to them." "They got better," Morrison replied. "They got you." As the investigation continued around them, Chun and Morrison stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise on a world where a terrible conspiracy had been exposed and justice was finally being served. The night had cost them dearly, but it had also proven that courage and determination could triumph over even the most powerful corruption. The enhancement programs would continue, military operations would be reformed, and the conspirators would face justice. But for now, Chun was content to watch the sunrise with a fellow warrior who understood the price of duty and the weight of sacrifice. In the distance, she could hear NATO personnel coordinating the investigation that would reshape American military operations. The evidence they had gathered would prevent future betrayals and ensure that the soldiers who served their country would never again be sacrificed for political gain. The mission was complete, and the truth had finally prevailed.